Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Tech Can Save Us podcast brought to you by Little Humans. As always, I'm Paul David, your host and CEO of Little Humans. I'm joined today by Antonio Ribeiro.
That's right.
Yeah. Founder and CEO of Yurtle. And we're going to talk today about Insurtech that prevents caregiver burnout. Tell us, first of all, just give us like high level, like what is Yurtle? What are y'all up to? And we've not talked about Insurtech a lot, so we might need to tell our audience a bit more about Insurtech as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with basically just a quick thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to chat. It's really nice to speak to you and to a new audience, as you say, about Insurtech, about caregiver burnout, stuff that we're very passionate about at Yurtle. To start with, I guess, the Insurtech side of things, just to clarify that right off the bat. And Insurtech, basically, we operate as something that's called a managing general agent. So ultimately, you do have these massive insurance companies. They can't be everywhere, so they lean on Insurtechs and managing general agents as an alternative distribution slipstream to reach parts of markets that they can't reach themselves.
What's the slipstream?
Yeah, so like essentially different distribution channels.
Okay.
So they have got very established channels, and then it takes something like a Yurtle to come in with a new tech, with a new customer segment focus, in order for us to help insurers spread their products that make a big difference in people's lives, but just in a different way. Yeah. So we essentially are a regulated and approved reseller of insurance products. So that's what an Insurtech is, and we don't bear any financial risk. And we just act as these regulated resellers. And so then Yurtle itself then is a business that's built, as you said rightly, focused on working caregivers. So people who are highly ambitious, have got all of these professional dreams like everybody else, say in a law firm, an accountancy. But in the meanwhile, they've also got these responsibilities at home of responsibility for an elderly relative they may care for, perhaps a sick or disabled relative they may care for. It also can just be, let's call it conventional childcare, if you will. And for 6.5 million people in the UK, it's actually both. They're called sandwich carers. So you've got this elder care responsibility that you're trying to balance with childcare responsibilities, and all the while trying to be the best version of your professional self that you can be. So Yurtle is conceived to support that audience, and we essentially sell products to their HR departments and to their companies and employers in order to support them in the same way that an employer might help you with, say, health insurance. They might support you with cycle to work schemes. People get very creative about what you can do to support. And so Yurtle is just a way to kind of step your company into what we believe to be a really pioneering, socially impactful space, which is essentially just helping people reconcile their obligations at home and their obligations at work. So at a high level, that's kind of our focus in the space we operate in.
Well, first things first, and I want to thank you, because we talked about this and sort of the pre-show. Is just that like you're dealing with like a very real problem. So like even at Little Humans, like I've got a elderly father who's suffering from dementia, unfortunately, and so I have caregiving responsibilities, and so he's very far away in the United States. But when I first found Yurtle, I was like, gosh, like we need this at Little Humans, and you've got other team members family members are getting older. One has Alzheimer's in particular, so this is a really real struggle in a microcosm sense. At LH, but also wanted to frame the problem for our audience as well in terms of like what's going on in the UK. So, recent estimates say 5.7 million unpaid carers in the UK, which is about 9% of the population, and 2.5 million of them are in full-time employment. 59% of unpaid carers are women. So there's a gender sort of inequity problem here. So how else would you sort of frame the broader problem that you're looking to tackle at Yurtle?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And firstly, thank you for your kind words. And also, I'm sorry to hear that you're also balancing this dynamic, because it can be very difficult to reconcile all these different parts of ourselves, right? But you're totally right in that it has a very real impact in people's everyday life. Yeah. So in the UK, and the UK is actually falls in line with global trends of aging. So we are more aged as a global population than we ever have been, and we're aging at an unprecedented rate as well. So people are having fewer kids, they're living longer, but with poorer health. And then you have systemic kind of structural levers of support, like the NHS, like the social care sector, that are trying their best to keep up, but are ultimately creaking with the demand that's being imposed on them. And so, as you rightly said, and just to add a new statistic, in the UK, families are essentially compensating for these structural deficits. So there's 12,000 people each day in the UK that step into this role of a family caregiver. So
12,000 every day.
It's insane.
Wow.
And the number that you mentioned, the 5.7, I mean, during COVID, that number actually exploded to 13 million. So as more and more people were pushed into frailty, and as the work and home lines started to blur because of COVID opening up people's living rooms as their office, it became less taboo in the workplace to speak about this. But ultimately, the main impetus behind the increase in caregiving is the fact that we're all aging, and not necessarily aging in good health. So we spend the last 12 years of our life with some kind of chronic morbidity that makes us very dependent on a loved one. And ultimately, that's the focus for Yurtle, and that's the main driver. And so it's a real sort of cluster of challenges coming together and kind of rearing their head at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, some of the other stats too as well, like 27% of carers have a disability, over half are, unpaid carers are Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. So it's not just a gender issue, it's an age issue, it's a, class issue, it's an ability issue,
Massively.
A race issue, yeah.
Massively. And the thing that's sad about it is that, a carer often has to make a decision, which is, if my employer isn't supporting me, I might have to make a call on, do I work fewer hours?
Yeah.
You then have to make a call on, okay, perhaps I need to be more local because I need to be supporting care in a slightly more active and physical way. So all of these things determine not just where you work, but how you can work and the type of work that you can do. And as you also rightly say, caregiving comes with a ton of out-of-pocket care expenses. And so it's ironic that actually the people who most need, the financial remuneration from a high-paying job are the people who are less able to sustain one. And hence why you see that women have weaker representation in senior leadership, because at the time that their job gets more and more demanding, say in their 40s, that also correlates when they're most likely to become a caregiver. So when they retire at 64, and you compare a comparable man and a woman will have £139,000 less in their pension pot than a man would, for example. And that also speaks through the gender pay gap and things like that.
Yeah, it just calcifies that gender pay gap and
it really
potential inequity. Yeah,
really challenging.
So it strikes me that your job at Yurtle and Insurtech in general is kind of plugging the gaps that are in the system, right? Like and or at least ensuring that the gaps people can be compensated for the gaps and things like that. But it's also an opportunity for new advancements, which is really exciting. One sort of example is the government passing a new law that entitles unpaid carers to 1 week of unpaid leave in 2022. It's not very much, but it's something. So just curious about your further analysis on the gaps that exist, but also the opportunities it presents for insurtechs like Yurtle.
Totally. And I was actually on a panel with the financial services sector on exactly this topic, which is, so there's been a bunch of change in the legislation, and it's the Carers Leave Act that you're referring to that's actually come into full force from April 2024, so this year.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely a big time for change. And I think, interestingly, the Carers Leave Act is a really big step forward in terms of destigmatizing the conversation of care in the workplace, because basically it bestows a variety of rights on caregivers and ensures that when they avail of those rights in the workplace, like the carers leave that you mentioned, of 1 week of unpaid leave from day one of employment, that people won't be discriminated against for leaning on that, which is huge.
If I could ask, what do you think's driving the destigmatization of all this? Because it strikes me that you've got some convincing to do, right? You have to kind of frame for people and employers, HR, heads of HR, that this is a problem. Obviously, the stats can speak for themselves, but what's driving the greater acceptance of the work that you're doing and the broader destigmatization of caregiving in the workplace?
That's an awesome question, because it's a really difficult thing to put your finger on exactly just one singular thing, but there's a few key drivers. And I'd say one of those drivers is certainly the blurring of the lines between work and home. So people have started to be more open with their employers about who they are and bringing your full self to work more than ever, I'd say.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think the destigmatization of related things. So a lot of workplaces have started to support their employees with fertility issues, with menopausal challenges and balancing your productivity whilst you experience that. And kind of by extension then, caregivers come into the conversation because it's essentially companies already showing their intent to try to address the equality of opportunity issues that might exist between men and women. And of course, I don't want to downplay that there are maybe 43% or somewhere around that number who are caregivers who are males, but in any case, as we mentioned, it's disproportionate. That the other kind of factor that might be driving that destigmatization is workplaces with cultures like your guys's, where I know from you that you are aware of which of your colleagues have caregiving responsibilities, for example. And I think generally speaking, workplaces that invest in psychological safety, you do start to earn, I guess, your colleagues' trust, and people start to have more open conversations with you. But where you work in an industry where perhaps it's a little bit more cutthroat, where perhaps it's more of a buyer's market of talent, then it gets a bit more difficult for people to feel vulnerable and to be able to really bring their full selves into work and to be able to say, you know, today I was less productive. And instead of having to fake and pull a sickie, you can actually say, well, my father fell over, or my kid really struggled with a kind of a behavioral kind of flare up, and therefore what would have been my productivity level and my level of presenteeism in any given day or week, it's taken a knock. And these are things that, you know, everybody lives with, but for some reason we feel like when we cross that threshold into work, we shouldn't socialize it. When I guess it's I think the psychologically safe workplaces will reap the benefits, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so getting to that point too, like sort of, you know, creating psychologically safe workplaces, and like this, we're seeing this big drive these days around like profitability, right? And like companies being, you know, just sort of, you know, the era of like, you know, just, you know, rampant VC funding in large ways is kind of over. So we look at stats like, you know, businesses lose 848, you know, pounds per care per year, a total of 4.8 billion. So sort of like, what do you say to the business owner who's sort of like, you know, this is all fine and good, but like, I know that the employee that's, you know, taking care of a little one at the same time as they're trying to work is going to be less productive. Like, it strikes me that you have to do a lot of convincing to like get employers to just, you know, invest in this to create those psychologically safe workplaces. So how do you respond and like make the business case, as it were, for Insurtech?
So really, I'd love to tell you that we've got that down completely.
Sure.
But definitely it's a work in progress for us, and I think it's a push and pull, right? So I do think that the kind of scare or fear, you can fearmonger. I don't think that that's the most compelling reason, but the fearmongering of legislation has changed. If you don't keep up with what you're needing to provide your employers from like a statutory point of view, it could expose your business to some type of liability risk.
So there's a compliance angle.
Yeah, so there's definitely a compliance angle that I think allows you to make a business case. And the other business case is just, you see certain industries struggle with it more than others, but certainly financial services, legal services, I'd say that it's probably not unfair to say that it's still easy to interpret success in that industry as being somewhat incongruent or somewhat incompatible with being the best mother you can be, being the best father you can be, being the best adult child that you can be to elderly parents. And so you have to make a very strong and compelling case around not just helping people understand the correlation between absenteeism in the workplace and those who might have responsibilities of care or be of that kind of age, but then also make the case that from an employee value proposition point of view, it's going to be very difficult for you to, one, attract the top female talent, or any kind of talent that has family responsibilities, but then also to retain those people, because 2 in 3 women, it's shown, have walked away from a promotion or from a job because they can't reconcile work and care. So,
and that's a strong argument, like that you are going to lose out on top talent because you've kind of written them off, just because they have caregiving responsibilities or that they want to take time out, whether that's in the short term or over, like a medium term. So that's a really interesting.
It absolutely is. And I think the thing that's really compelling to us is it's whether or not an employer knows it, these things are happening in their workforce,
that's
right?
a good point.
And you can just basically make a decision as an employer. I'm going to address this up front and make it comfortable enough for us to have these conversations in a way where people don't fear that, when promotion seasons come around, they'll be overlooked, or that their colleagues will question their commitment to their role, etc. And I think if you're the type of employer that's brave enough to have that initial conversation and kind of scratch under the surface, and you will uncover people who are struggling to balance these things and to reconcile their identities and stuff like that. I think you will benefit massively from being that type of employer, and it will pay back in a really significant way.
I think I want to sort of make that, that's a really powerful argument, like the pay less or maybe a modest amount now, invest now, or pay more later, on the back end.
Exactly.
Like maybe that sort of makes that sort of 4.8 billion figure larger because you're triaging, you're reacting instead of being proactive about, investing in Insurtech, for example, to deal with this stuff.
Exactly. And I'll just make another point, which is that a lot of companies will, depending on their gender makeup, depending on their population, in terms of age, the average age, you will see a lot of variation. And I think another really key challenge in this is, irrespective of the exact composition of your workforce, is that a lot of caregivers actually don't self-identify as being a caregiver, which is a really interesting thing. And a challenge for us as a business is people will intuitively say, I don't have any carers, because people don't feel comfortable talking about it. And then on top of that, to add another layer, people who are caregivers aren't telling you they're caregivers, also in part because they don't identify as that. So they just see themselves as a loving wife or husband or a supportive son or daughter. And so they don't accept that label because it doesn't resonate. And so it actually is an obstacle to them seeking out the help that they actually should be.
It's just an identity they've absorbed, inside of who they are.
And it takes on average 2 years for somebody to actually start to self-identify as a caregiver.
2 years of caregiving.
Yeah, 2 years.
And that's based on research that you all
from Carers.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you're facing kind of a sort of identification issue in terms of, well, one, at the individual level, but two, how do companies even understand the number and sort of,
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So it's it's a dual challenge, and part of the functionality in our app actually helps people triangulate how many hours of care that they spend in delivering in any day, in any given day, week, month, or year. So it's actually helping them understand that, over the last, let's say, 3 months, you were at your father's GP in this number of times, and this is how long you spent there. You were over at your father's house this amount of times, and this is how long you spent there. And also maybe at the local pharmacy or the local supermarket to your father's house. And all of these things constitute hours of care. And by the way, did you know that made you eligible for XYZ benefit or exemption from tax requirements, so from a point of view from your local authority and things like that.
It's a great segue into, because my next question is just about, how precisely you integrate into businesses and benefit those businesses and their employees, and just kind of getting into the features and benefits of Yurtle. But it just strikes me that we have a setup now where, because there's a stigma and we don't have wonderful tools like Yurtle to kind of truly integrate, using that word in, its most powerful sense. People have to do, I did this last week, I had to go to a doctor's appointment at 8:30 in the morning on a Friday. And, I just kind of cheekily, didn't log in until 9:30 until my appointment was done. We're supposed to log in at 9, but didn't say anything. I'm the boss. I can get away with stuff like that. But it just strikes me, I don't want to be unfair to team members who have to do that, because that's the window they have to go. And maybe they work a half hour later. Right. But there's not systems set up, and for example, compensation and Insurtech, to sort of fully integrate the life that your employee actually has into the work that they have to do. So just, yeah, I want to dig into kind of how, and Insurtech generally, but Yurtle specifically, is helping to integrate the full life of employees into
Absolutely.
business. Yeah.
Well, firstly, I just want to say, commend you for that self-awareness as a leader, because what you just said, I think, is demonstrative of somebody who is a really empathetic leader, which is the things that I could get away with and feel like I could get away with, if you will, are things that perhaps my colleagues wouldn't feel that, because they're not the leader. And that compares as a stark contrast with a conversation that I had with a HR director the other day, who said, we've got a great workplace culture. I care for, I think it was his mother, and he's got childcare responsibilities. And he was saying, we think we've done a really good job here because, for example, when I want to take some time off at late notice to help my mother to her GP, let's say, that's something that I feel really empowered to do, and I can just do that, and the business won't judge me for it. And I think that that's incredible, because clearly for him to have that level of psychological safety, it's pointing in the right direction. But I doubt whether, for example, say an HR graduate in his team, or somebody who's been around then maybe only for a few months and as a new employee, that they'd feel that level of confidence, because it's something that wasn't codified in the company. It was just something that he'd had an understanding, having worked there for 6 years and being the head of HR.
Yeah.
But if you're an analyst or you're new, you don't know that. And unless you have an internal kind of workplace policy that, as you say, formalizes and captures the intent of the company and the kind of protections that people are afforded, you'd probably assume that you're better off just saying, sorry, the trains didn't work and hence I'm an hour late.
Yeah.
Or and you start to launder this caregiving conversation into sickness conversations, and therefore it never really gets diagnosed and it never gets addressed. And so I just wanted to say that, I mean, that's an awesome step. And I think it's also a really helpful segue actually into discussing, kind of just trying to lay out in a clear, hopefully, way the ways that we can actually implement our support in and actually try to make a change in the grassroots of the company as well. So we initially, and let's just take a big software business that we onboarded recently, we start the journey with any new client to say, okay, so we understand that you'll have bereavement internal policies, you'll have holiday policies, you'll have diversity and inclusion policies, but perhaps those are things that have grown a little bit stale over time. You haven't looked at them maybe in 5, maybe 10 years. And so what we say is things have changed a lot in society in terms of societal expectations, employees' expectations around family needs and kind of reconciling that with work. So what we say is, why don't you share with us your internal policies? We'll do a quick policy audit that helps you and us understand where the gaps may be as it relates to care and inclusion. And then the product of that conversation is then Yurtle helping that employer put in place a bespoke, personalized workplace inclusion policy for that company, where the gaps that existed no longer exist. And it actually starts to also empower, really critically, middle management to say, in an era where people don't want to say the wrong thing or come across as unempathetic, it's really important to empower your hiring managers and say your middle managers with a very clear mandate of, this is where the company stands on this. This is what you can promise your employees. And this is the degree to which you'll be supported as a caregiver in the workplace.
That seems important too, because middle managers, I think recent research, they have it the toughest. They're the ones who are the most likely to kind of, flame out or leave their jobs or, be, and then they're kind of caught in the middle because they have to implement these policies that maybe they feel are unfair, maybe they are unfair, and they're dealing with, the folks at maybe the junior level sort of coming with these issues of I have caregiving responsibilities, things like that. So I think
they're the first line of defense. You're totally right. They're the first line that, not only do they carry a lot of pressure because you've got, P&L responsibilities as well as then maybe responsibilities at home. But the one, if there's ever a silver bullet, and there isn't, flexibility at work is the best thing you can afford any caregiver or any parent or anything like that in the workplace, I think. And what I would argue as well is that hiring managers, if you've got the kind of, or middle managers or line managers, if you've got that type of responsibility with your colleagues, where your colleague can just come up to you and say XYZ has happened and be open about that, that is the single most empowering thing for you as a caregiver, because if your line manager trusts you, they know that you will have to take maybe a day or a couple of hours in any given day to support with the caregiving responsibilities you've got, but They know that you'll catch up later. And that kind of level of trust and engendering that trust is really important. It's a big part that this policy plays into it.
It's good that you start with, kind of this mapping of the company's policies, because it just, again, back to the point of like filling gaps and things like that. It strikes me that like some of this stuff is just like calcified in the company structure and procedures and things like that. So you're kind of like dealing with that first, and then you're moving into things like, corporate discounts and caregiver insurance. And, so yeah, curious to hear about that.
That's, exactly right. Yeah. And a lot of people have done a lot of good work, and it's just a case of incremental improvements. And that foundation is really important, as you say. And then outside of that, then we say, okay, so for some people, that's as far as they want to go. And that's as far as perhaps they've got budget in terms of internal well-being budget. But for those that don't, and that they do want to go further, and they do want to start to differentiate their employee value proposition by virtue of supporting caregivers and families, at that point, we then give them two options to engage with our product. So one is a very critical continuity of care insurance promise that we make. So we spent a lot of time with focus groups, and everyone at Yurtle has either had secondhand or first-hand experience of caregiving themselves. But ultimately, what we are able to, provide is a huge and very important peace of mind insurance promise, where we say, we understand that as a caregiver, in most cases, you're the only line of defense for your loved one and your dependent. So what we say is, should your health ever break down and preclude you from delivering the care that you usually would, say again for a father with dementia, Yurtle will step in, pay for and find you backup professional care anywhere in the UK within hours. So you can sleep easy at night, which people don't do today, knowing that if everything hits the fan, you've got a safe pair of hands from trained, specialized, vetted professionals who can step in. Yeah. So that's one half of the promise that we make. And I guess that really leans on our insurance credentials. And we work with a big global insurance company that has all of the relevant kind of capital reserves and checks to ensure that when they're needed, they will step in through Yurtle to basically support the household in the way it needs to be. Outside of that, then we have our app that basically is offered, again, to employees free of charge. That ultimately, the key USP is that we allow you to build a resilient care team around you as that primary caregiver of your friends, your family, your neighbors, social care workers, such that, again, that over-dependence and that single point of failure on you is something that is addressed. So what that might mean is that you don't have to be the one who has to step away from meetings early to go and collect your kids, or to go and ensure that your dad is taking the medication he needs. But actually you can start to share in an effective way, not just the physical tasks of care, but then also start to get some recognition for the care that you do give and the sacrifices that you make. Because a key issue for people is dealing mentally with the feelings of resentment that start to creep in amongst adult siblings, where normally a woman would take, say, 90% of the responsibility of care and enable everybody else's burden-free life by virtue of basically taking that all on her shoulders, right? So our app facilitates that communication and that planning in a really kind of tangible way. Outside of that, then we also connect people to the right questions to ask, as well as the right answers to those questions. Because when you're thrust into care, and a lot of times you are basically completely inexperienced in performing that role for a loved one.
These are questions about how to be an effective caregiver.
That's exactly right. So like, for example, how do I ensure that I've got the right legal infrastructure in place, like a power of attorney? What is a power of attorney? That kind of thing. And how do I
for it?
Exactly that. Handing people templates as to how their role of carer will overlap effectively with financial management, legal planning, planning generally for the condition, kind of the specific condition. So how does dementia develop over time, and therefore how will my role develop over time? And then outside of that, so we don't want it to just be an information-only platform. And so not only do we help you professionalize your informal and social networks of support, we then actually connect you to services that are leading in their field as it relates to, for example, legal support, as it relates to even, for example, domestic cleaning support, because we understand that 80% of caregiving is like support with menial tasks, cooking, cleaning, shopping. So if you can shift some of that over and secure Yurtle preferential rates on all of those providers, then that's something that really, again, makes you more resilient and moves you away from the current position of being this kind of single point of failure.
Two things you said there I really like. One is like the way that you're leveraging educational content. Obviously, we love that as a content marketing agency, but that's like a huge part of it. It's just like sort of getting the education level up for, among the caregivers, but also among like the companies and the broader public about like what is actually going on, for caregivers and those that they're caring for. They have to deal with these legal issues and, menial tasks like cleaning and like all these different things. So there's just like a huge education task that strikes me that you're involved in. The other piece is like the formalization of it, like in a way, it sounds like this is a second job, and like you're formalizing that and you're saying, listen, these are all the things that these people have to do from legal work to cleaning and, other bits of caregiving that tend to kind of fly under the radar. So like, I think the formalization of this is a really important part of the work that you're doing. That like, let's just elevate and sort of, put some sunlight on the work these people are doing and really map it out because it is a second job, taking care of people.
It is. And I think people just do it intuitively and that it's a labor of love.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's not taxing and it doesn't mean that it accumulates over time and suddenly catches up with you, right? So I think the final thing that's worth mentioning just on the functionality is that we leverage geofencing technology to essentially play that role of triangulating that carer self-identification piece, which is just basically with your permission as a user, you'd essentially signal to Yurtle that you're happy for us to track your location either all the time or part of the time. And essentially that information then not only can be used to help you understand that in the last week you spent 60 hours delivering care or whatever it may be, but then also helps us personalize our service recommendations, helps us personalize our content recommendations because alongside location data, you then also interact with the app to try to share how you're feeling. So we start to study through our app correlations between when you deliver personal hygiene care. In those days, it seems like your mood is particularly low. Have you considered leaning on one of our professional carers to do that piece of work such that you can be focusing on, say, companionship care and something like that?
That's powerful to get down to the level of like the mood and well-being of the carer in the given day as it relates to tasks. Like that's really deep work. Wanted to dig in where we are a content marketing agency, growth marketing agency, and obviously like big task before you is growing your user base, communicating with these companies and HR directors about the benefits of your platform. So we'd love to just like kind of understand how you've grown Yurtle and any partnerships or sort of particular growth strategies that you're excited about, maybe ones that are a bit prospective. How are you, how have you been and how are you looking forward to growing the Yurtle user base and sort of spreading the good word?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we've learned a lot. So we initially launched our product with a thought that we'd be distributing our product through care homes. And we started just as COVID started to set in as a public health crisis. And obviously the ramifications for the care home sector was massive. The sector was perceived to be unsafe at that time for people, given the proximity, right, and the frailties of people who would be in a care home. So we did obviously some pretty not voluntary, I should say, kind of pivots into essentially what would be an effective growth strategy in given that that's not an angle that we can continue to pursue. And so that's when we made our pivot into tying the fortunes and the productivity of a company to the lived reality of caregiving, which is a very real thing. We just started to shine a light on it. And so, as I mentioned, HR is the P&L that we sell into a company. And we live in a world, and you actually alluded to it earlier, where VC money, because of where interest rates were for the longest time, was plentiful in the employee benefit space. So essentially, HR managers have been hounded by direct cold outreach from, health providers, a variety of different kind of benefits, and everybody's doing great work and they want to shout about it. But the product of that is that these poor well-being and HR managers are getting hounded by hundreds of different people each day. So it's just contributing to this real sense of noise in the space. And more than ever, therefore, these intermediaries that are called employee benefits consultancies that basically operate between a provider such as Yurtle and a buyer such as, let's say, McDonald's. And these guys basically help UK corporates separate the signal from the noise and not only help them ascertain what are the most meaningful and pressing problems your employees are facing, but then also which are the providers that you can trust to solve that reliably at the best or most efficient price.
So are they kind of like sort of the gatekeepers of what benefits
Exactly
get
right.
into? Yeah.
Yeah, so they act as our gatekeeper. So you can't ignore their importance in setting the agenda and influencing a buyer, but then also in very actively endorsing certain providers that they believe, having done, a big kind of landscaping of the market, they'll decide, okay, this is the safest pair of hands. That will represent my client's needs the best.
So you have to convince these intermediaries to sort of buy into Yurtle, and then as sort of a step into.
That's exactly right. So we basically went through a period of, say, like 8 months where we were going through the very rigorous due diligence processes that these guys put any provider through.
Okay.
And once you get through the door in that regard, it's then a case of, okay, how can you then engage the individual client managers there who work, who understand at a really granular level what their clients are facing and what they need support with. So a big part of our growth strategy is essentially how can we enable sales in the most effective way, and how can we get our value proposition to be articulated in a way that is easy enough for somebody who doesn't have all the context of Yurtle, doesn't have all the context of caregiving, to do that effectively. So we've invested in videos, we've invested in kind of more static marketing materials that really allows people to do that role of selling for us in some cases.
And are you solving for that with your in-house team? Are you working with freelancers? Are you hiring agencies? Like, how are you structuring that work of kind of selling and sort of putting out the brand TOV, tone of voice for Yurtle?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So what we wanted to do in the first instance was to lean internally on our existing team and resources to develop and articulate our TOV, because we thought that that's something that we're uniquely placed to do.
Sure.
And at some point then we realized, okay, so once we feel confident in how we're coming across and we're confident that these are the right kind of chosen channels, at that point we started to engage help from a contractor to help us actually design then or bring to life our TOV and bring to life our brand. And so we tend to operate on that flexible basis with the design community, the marketing community, and we don't actually have anybody inside of Yurtle who's a full-time employee who's dedicated to that full-time.
Got it.
And that tends to be captured by our product function as well as in our sales function. It kind of sits in some sort of sketchy Venn diagram.
Sure. Got it. Okay, that's interesting. And it's worth mentioning that we got connected through the co-founders at Juniper who have a killer TOV that, there's this dental insurance, but for your genitals.
Yeah.
Can't say that enough. But thanks to Sam and Ambra for connecting us. But yeah, I mean, it's so have you landed on anything that you're particularly excited about in terms of your TOV or how you convey what Yurtle does, to broader audiences? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, it's a great question.
If it's too early, that's okay.
No, it's Juniper, I think, have done an awesome job of capturing the essence of what they're doing, because it captures the essence that is akin to Yurtle around it being slightly taboo or slightly stigmatized or difficult to talk about these things, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So we still our TOV really just speaks to essentially fighting unnecessary absence in the workplace that comes from trying to reconcile work and care.
Yeah.
So a lot less tight, but ultimately it helps us understand that our main focus is the working carer population, because there is a big carer population that's dropped out of work altogether because they can't reconcile that thing. So, but our focus really is, okay, those that are still working and trying to balance and make that work, that's our audience. And ultimately it's all about leveraging the workplace as well as that distribution channel. So for us, I mentioned these employee benefits consultancies. It's then also the case that a lot of large insurance companies, life insurance companies and non-life insurance companies that provide, say, employee benefits such as life insurance in the company. So any kind of person who leans on those type of behemoths to get that type of support, we're also working with them to essentially try to attach our app functionality to their existing products. And that gives us an incredible reach that in some ways bypasses the need to go through a consultant. So it accelerates the sale in that really effective way. But one, I guess, perennial frustration, I think, of anybody who tries to sell into companies is, especially in the kind of employee well-being space, is that you don't have many opportunities to connect directly with your, not just your customer base, but also your user base. Until we've successfully sold into a company, we won't really be having that many communication touch points with our users, which is a thing that obviously the direct to consumer world has over us in a huge way. So whilst ours is arguably more scalable from a unit economics point of view, it's got its massive challenges as well in terms of the feedback loop of information for us to
I was going to say that limits your ability to get that feedback, back into that will then shape your strategy, your TOV and stuff like that. But I mean, I appreciate where you're at, in terms of developing that brand tone of voice. And I think, to ask you about the name here, but Yurtle, sort of how it represents protection and longevity and sustainability, but also connecting it to like this idea of like focusing on employee absences or diminished presence, you know what I mean? And I think I can almost like see an ad that's like sort of, these employees like disappearing from the workplace, disappearing from their chairs and sees. I mean, some maybe work on it together.
I also love the concept of a diminished presence. That's really interesting.
Or like maybe they're shaded gray or something like that,
really
like they go to black and white instead of in full color. We can work on it together.
Absolutely.
But like I think that's so tangible for business owners and HR directors, because like we're a small company. Like I really feel it when designer I don't want to call it any names, but when someone's out of the office, or when I can really tell that someone's just not switched on because they're dealing with something. Like as an employer, you really feel that. You feel it in your P&L. You feel it in just the presence in the workplace. So I would encourage you to like keep going with that, because I think that's so tangible for business owners and employers to kind of we can sort of quantify the losses and things like that, as we just did earlier. So I think it's powerful.
I really appreciate that. And it's actually, I had a very unhappy reminder of why the work that we do is important if I ever needed it, which was my grandmother. I've supported my grandmother with vascular dementia alongside my family members, and some in specific who were assigned to specific roles and functions to help her live through that. But she passed away 6 weeks ago.
Sorry to hear that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And the reminder that I had was, as vascular dementia progresses, it tends to progress through different strokes that an individual lives through, and their condition that then worsens, and the amount of, I guess, plaque in their brain and the neurodegenerative process really accelerates through those kind of stroke periods. And it was a huge reminder when my grandmother was admitted into the hospital. She never actually made it out of the hospital, but in any case, she was admitted into the hospital. And the next step, and we realized as a family, you drop everything. Right? And we'd had that before with my grandfather who lived with ALS, but in any case, it made me really become razor sharp focused on, okay, what are the main questions that when that acute crisis happens, what's the next thing I'm thinking about? And it's when she's discharged, how will I ensure that she has the medical accompaniment that she needs, such that she stays independent for as long as she can? How do I make sure that mentally that she's plugged into a sense of community so she doesn't feel lonely and isolated, which can obviously precipitate and accelerate symptoms of dementia? And then the third thing is, who's going to make sure that the little things that she needs in the day-to-day that she can't do for herself, like feeding, cleaning, etc., who's going to be doing that? And do we trust them? And who's going to pay for it? And essentially, that level of confusion, together with the level of pressure, which is, someone that you love, who has always loved you and always provided for you, suddenly needs you. And it's a sense of responsibility that's so heightened. And even though I'm the founder of Yurtle and very few things mean to me as much as the well-being of our company, suddenly everything goes into context. So to your point, I can see why, when one of your colleagues is operating at, say, 40%, that you feel that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to start wrapping up.
Last question. Want to hear a bit more about your journey as a founder and sort of, like what you've shared a lot about your personal motivations, but, and we like to not quite ask for advice, but just sort of understand the lessons you've learned along the way. So maybe if you can give us like 1 or 2 key lessons you've learned, in the past few years about leadership. You strike me as a deeply, empathic and, well put together founder who kind of gets all the different angles of leadership. So just like curious to hear any lessons that you could share, that like stuff that's worked for you that you'd really encourage other founders in Insurtech or the tech space broadly to sort of, potentially take up in their own practice.
Yeah, firstly, I'm grateful that that's how I come across, or that's how you perceive me. That's it's certainly not the way that I feel, and I think um, one thing I would definitely say is learning to deal or manage or accept that inner critic and that voice is never going to go away is one thing. I struggle a lot with self-doubt, and I struggle a lot with feeling confident that the route that I've chosen for the business is the right route. And so one thing that I've been working on is trying to write down what my goals are today, because I've got a tendency, and I think lots of founders have a tendency, to not pay attention to the wins that you've had, and the goalposts keep shifting such that over 2 years you think, what have I achieved? I still haven't hit XYZ commercial milestone that I have. But when you really think about it, you've hit all these other milestones that you should be feeling proud of.
Yeah.
And so for me, that management of that inner critic and that self-doubt is something that I find that founders really lose a lot of productive energy to, and a lot of sleepless nights thinking about that. So I'd say active strategies to managing that and to keeping yourself accountable to your wins and your losses, I think, is really important. And the other thing that I would say that is really critical is, in light of the fact, that it's very well publicized. They're starting and running a company is it's a marathon, and it's got lots of ups and downs. For me, also, what I found has been really effective is, how can I put this in the best way? It's finding meaning outside of work, but also finding that anchor reason as to why, when things get difficult, why you should bother the next day to show up.
Yeah.
And so for me, I had experiences of workplace cultures that didn't align with what I thought was best practice. And so for me, even though caregiving has got such personal meaning to me, actually the thing that most deeply motivates me is creating a workplace where people are treated with integrity, with dignity, and they can feel like they can bring their authentic self, and that will be invested in by their colleagues. So for me, it's that workplace culture and really rooting myself in that really gets me going again when I've had the latest kind of down period at work. So it's funny that I've gone for two kind of mental health management things, and it's no surprise, because I think that the mental health of the founder is the thing that will keep your business alive or dead within the first 5 years. We're disproportionately important to the well-being and the welfare of our business. And if we're not feeling well, that just comes across to investors, comes across to partners, to employees. And that's a real challenge.
Well, amen to that. From founder to founder, like I really feel that, and I can feel those waves as I'm really tapped in and when I'm really tapped out and things like that. So I really appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate how those connect together as well, and sort of, this idea that the founder is sort of like the locus of control in a lot of ways, but like the culture you build around you at the same time, like really matters. So
I mean, my team is awesome, and they do things that I could never imagine doing, and I think that's really important, because when you hire good people and you empower them to be their best, it makes you feel good that actually these really bright people chose your business, your mission, as you've articulated it. I think that's really helped me with kind of silencing my inner critic as well.
Yeah, we'll have to cut there, but this has been another fantastic episode of Tech Can't Save Us podcast. We've been joined today by Antonio Ribeiro, the founder and CEO of Yurtle, an organization that, they're Insurtech, and they prevent caregiver burnout, and doing amazing work. Where can folks find out more about Yurtle and just connect with you all on the interwebs?
LinkedIn and our website would probably be the two best bets.
We'll share those in the episode description, obviously. And this has been honestly one of the most heartfelt conversations where, we're both so deeply connected to this issue. So I really appreciate that and your time coming down here, Antonio. And so,
Thank you so much. It's been really great. Thank you.
Absolutely. And for our guests, please, as always, subscribe. We'd love to bring on more great guests like Antonio. So please give us a 5-star rating if you are so inclined, and we can bring on more great guests like Antonio. Check us out at littlehumans.com/podcast. Tech Can't Save Us. And thanks for listening.